Welcome to the 5th Annual Food Justice Film Festival, presented by the Center for Biological Diversity. I'm Linda Rico, Food Justice Film Festival organizer with the Center. Today, I am joined by Alexis Guild, Vice President of Strategy and Programs, and Becca Young, Director of Programs from Farmworker Justice. Alexis joined Farmworker Justice in 2011. In her role as Vice President of Strategy and Programs, she coordinates policy, advocacy, and programmatic work and is a member of the leadership team. She has extensive experience in public health and community organizing, is a published author, and has worked on political campaigns and at grassroots organizations. Becca joined Farmworker Justice in 2010 and currently serves as the Director of Programs. Becca's had the opportunity to engage with farm worker communities across the United States. Through her work in program management, training, and curriculum development, she interacts frequently with health outreach workers on various health topics, such as pesticide safety, heat stress prevention, and HIV/AIDS awareness, to name a few. Welcome, and thank you both so much for joining me today.
Great. Thank you so much for having us.
Of course. Thank you both. So I want to jump right in. This year, all 4 of the films that we are featuring, Dolores, The Smell of Money, Into the Weeds, and Invisible Valley, they all discuss or touch on the importance of food and farm worker health and safety protections and the surrounding community's public health. Between extreme weather, dangerous pesticide use, pollution from factory farms, and exhausting days and nights with low pay, the many food and farm workers, especially migrant and immigrant workers, who plant, grow, and harvest the food we eat, put their health and safety at risk every single day. What roles do you both have at Farmworker Justice to help food and farm workers in terms of their work and their health and safety?
Great. So I can jump in and then Alexis, you can chime in. But so really working helping workers with health and safety is at the core of so much of what we do at Farmworker Justice. As the director of programs and having specifically worked in programs work throughout my career at Farmworker Justice, I've had that opportunity to work very closely with lots of different community-based organizations that are kind of out there literally in the fields, helping farm workers, learning and educating about what are the various issues and challenges that farm workers face. And so we've done a lot of work over the years in pesticide safety. That's really one of those core areas that impacts both farm workers and their families in terms of their health, their daily health, and then when you look at sort of the impacts over the long range. And then over these last years as well, we've done a lot of work in heat stress. And that's something that probably many of you have been hearing more and more about in the news with all of the climate change that our world has been experiencing. And what has been really, I think, empowering about that work in the heat stress field is that there are very simple, sometimes simple things that that workers can do to protect themselves more, but then also there are the more systemic issues that are at hand that prevent farm workers from being able to protect themselves, from the sun.
Right.
And so my role at Farmworker Justice is to work closely with Becca on our programmatic work, but also I oversee our policy advocacy work and work closely with litigation. So what makes Farmworker Justice unique is we are a national organization and we take a multifaceted approach. So we have the programs that Becca oversees, working closely with community-based organizations to provide training and technical assistance, capacity building, education, to ensure that they have information about healthcare, about heat protections, about wildfires, and other issues that affect farm workers and their health and safety and access to healthcare. But then we also work on the policy front to ensure those protections are in place, because as we know, many of the issues that farm workers face are systemic issues. Right. And we need, solutions that really address those those systemic issues. And a lot of that is policy. And so I work closely with our partners in Washington, D.C., as well as across the states, to ensure that there are protections in place for all workers, including heat safety protections, other occupational safety and health protections, labor protections. And we also work closely with our state partners as well. And then, of course, litigation supports those efforts. So that is really my role. And we are a small but mighty team. So we work closely with our partners, but we also work very closely with each other to ensure that all of it really comes together, that policy informs our programs, informs our litigation, and also to ensure, and Becca's role and our role with the programs is crucial to ensure that the work that we do at all levels, it really comes from the farm worker community. So ensuring that, we are able not only to share information with farm workers, but they share information with us that we then take back to the policy level here in DC.
That's awesome. And what has your experience been like helping these farm workers and food workers gain access to basic health care across the country? And if you can share, what have been some of the major obstacles that you've experienced?
I'll start. I think that's a topic that's been really complicated for farm workers for so long, for so many different reasons. There are all kinds of factors out there. Of course, access to insurance is a big factor, and something that can prevent many farm workers from getting specialty care that they might need. Things like transportation. So farm workers that are either living or working in more remote locations that have difficulty, getting into the clinic to get the help that they need. The wages that they make typically, won't cover. I mentioned specialty care, and that's another issue. So there are many clinics that might offer primary care, but to get to the specialty care, sometimes that can be further away. And so thinking about the hours that farm workers work typically, and that if they are able to take a day off, they are typically not paid to take that time off. And so how that can present another barrier for farm workers as they're trying to access health care. And my colleague, so Alexis, has worked kind of in that health access realm with farm workers for many years. So I imagine you have a lot to say on this topic, Alexis.
Well, I think you covered a lot of it. There are so many barriers to care, but there are also, methods to improve that access. So for example, health centers, community health centers, migrant health centers specifically, many of them have outreach staff, mobile clinics, transportation, interpretation. There are things that they are doing to improve access to healthcare and ensure that workers are able to access the services. Farm workers, as Becca mentioned, don't really have access to health insurance. And I think what's also important to keep in mind is that farm workers don't have sick leave. And so if a farm worker is sick, they won't necessarily be able to go to the clinic because they worry about losing wages. They worry about retaliation if they might be fired. And so oftentimes farm workers have these chronic conditions, and yet they don't really go to seek healthcare unless it's something that is urgent. And so, and that means that farm workers are not really accessing the preventive care that they need. And then the specialty care, as Becca mentioned, is so difficult, especially being in rural communities, lacking that health insurance, lacking transportation. There are so many barriers in place, but there are organizations, there are health centers, there are movements to improve that access.
Why do you think still now there isn't, good pay and there isn't access to these things? I mean, how have we gotten away with this for so long?
So when the Fair Labor Standards Act was first implemented, well, when it was first being debated actually in Congress, in order to get it passed, there were compromises made. And one of the compromises was the exemption of agriculture. And so, and those roots are racist in their origin, because they needed those Southern Democrats to come on board. And so with that exemption, farm workers were carved out of any of the protections that other US workers have to this day. Now, some of those protections have been restored. For example, farm workers have access to federal minimum wage, and that came about in the 1960s. But farm workers are still exempt from workers' compensation in many states. They also are exempt from overtime at the federal level. And they also, but some states have put that in place. They also have exemptions around child labor. And so you can be as young as 12 and legally work in the fields. That is not the case in other industries. And as we know, agriculture is extremely hazardous, right. And it has a high fatality rate. And for children especially, there are implications around developmental issues that can develop, at being exposed to pesticides and other hazards in the fields. So that exemption for agriculture, I think, is the reason why farm workers lack those protections. Now, of course, there are some safety protections. There's the field sanitation standard, there's the worker protection standard, but enforcement is spotty. And, that imbalance between the workers who are vulnerable. Many lack documentation status, about half lack documentation status. There's a growing number of workers on an H-2A visa, which is tied to their employer. So they are often not able to report any violations because of fear of retaliation. Right. And just that imbalance of power allows a system where farm workers are exploited. I will add, however, that if you talk to farm workers, what they really emphasize is the dignity of farm work, the pride that they take in being part of our food system, right. And in contributing to our economies, to our communities, and being part of the reason why we have fruits and vegetables on our table.
So in terms of the conservation work that the Center for Biological Diversity does, we know that meat and dairy industries are not only major contributors of climate change, but these industries are also known for having very dangerous and abusive work environments. There have been serious and fatal accidents, not only on the field, but in slaughterhouses and on animal production lines, unclean work environments, facilitating the spread of diseases and viruses like COVID-19, avian flu. There's been known worker abuse, and of course, respiratory and other serious health problems from animal waste pollution in the air, ground, and the water. How much more difficult, if at all, is it when trying to get worker protections for those who are working in slaughterhouses or in CAFOs, which are controlled animal farming operations, compared to those who are out in the field?
So we don't work directly with slaughterhouse workers or workers on CAFOs, but I think many of the issues are the same. It's a primarily immigrant workforce. It's a workforce who are limited English proficient, who have low wages, and there is fear around any kind of retaliation. So there is a lack of ability to, or a lack of agency
Mhm.
in their workplace. You know, the slaughterhouses, just like the fields,
Mhm.
the conditions are out of the control of the worker. So, you know, we can provide information to workers on how to protect themselves from heat.
Mhm.
But if there's no standard,
Mhm.
if there's no regulation, then, you know, there is no expectation that employers will put in place those protections. Now, that is not to say that there are not employers who do care about their workers. There are. And there are employers who do the right thing. And there are employers who put in those protections. But unfortunately, there are also employers who do not, and who exploit the workers because they can, because they are workers who are not able, for various reasons, to assert their rights.
Mhm.
And I think that is an issue across agriculture, across the slaughterhouses. I think we saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Mhm.
We are seeing that with H5N1. You know, we do work with dairy workers, and I do fear that, you know, H5N1 is underreported. And I think workers are not necessarily getting the information they need about about the disease itself, about the risk factors, and about how to protect themselves.
Mhm.
And I think that's a real issue, but that again comes from that inequality.
Right. Have you found, because there's one of the films, Invisible Valley, follows farm workers in Coachella Valley, and they
Mm-hmm.
really want to try to, show that disparity between these farm workers that are on this side, and then you have all the wealthy snowbirds on this side. But how, season to season, these farm workers, whether they're out in the field or whether they're picking up trash at Coachella, they're there trying to survive. And I was curious, in the work that you both do, have you found that some of the farm workers and food workers that you're helping, that you watch them fluctuate like that through different types of jobs?
Yeah, it can often happen for farm workers, like, from depending on where, sorry, my dog is barking there.
Okay.
But depending on where the farm workers are living and working, farm work is often seasonal. And so that means that they do need other jobs to kind of hop in and out of, depending on what is happening in the ag industry. So we do see a lot of overlap between construction work, for example. So maybe they'll be harvesting straw or planting and then harvesting strawberries kind of throughout the summer, early fall. Then they move into the construction, arena. Then they'll start working in ag work again in the spring when that opens up. But yeah, you definitely see a lot of that, really trying to make ends meet.
Mhm.
Um, and and yet, a lot of the work in agriculture demands very skilled labor.
Mhm.
And so these workers have built up, tremendous experience, and but yet they're not able to kind of exercise like that sort of specialty necessarily in skill all year long. I'm not sure, Alexis, is there data on kind of that percentage that move in and out of the industry, kind of on that more seasonal or temporary basis?
There is some data. We have the National Cultural Workers Survey.
Mhm.
It does seem like fewer workers are migrating. There were these traditional migrant streams, the West, which was California to Washington, the
Mhm.
Midwest, Texas to Michigan or to the Midwest area, and then the East Coast, which is Florida, up to Maine.
Mhm.
But in the past decade, there have been fewer farm workers migrating, especially along those streams. And I think part of the reason is because of just regulations and laws here in the United States that have prevented or have um, made people less inclined
Mhm.
to migrate for various reasons. And then I also think more workers are settling out. And so they are, like Becca said, they are working in agriculture during the planting and harvest season, but then perhaps working in packing or construction or other jobs during the off season.
Right.
More workers are now coming from other countries on these H-2A visas. There are a growing number of workers here in the US. And I think that has also perhaps replaced some of that need for migratory labor because they have these H-2A workers coming in for those short seasonal jobs.
Right.
So I think it really depends, but certainly, families need support. And, we work closely with Migrant and Seasonal Head Start. They have grantees across the country who specifically serve migratory and seasonal agricultural workers and their families. And Migrant Seasonal Head Start are really important sources of childcare, of education, for the children of the workers, but they also work closely with the parents as well in order to empower parents, to ensure that parents know about their rights, about how to advocate for themselves and for their children. And so, they do have support in many of these communities.
Right. This brought up another question for me too. I'm sorry, I'm springing some extra questions on you both. But in some of our past films that we've shown, we see that there are these farm workers, they're in these different areas depending on the season. We also see that they don't have access to, proper homes, and there's just no stability there. There's also this narrative of, wow, even though they're out there and they're picking our food, for the food that we eat, a lot of times they can't even afford that same food in the stores. And I wanted to know, or get your thoughts on, as you're working with them, especially like in terms of health, have you seen like there's a big disparity in terms of their own personal health too, because of the food that they don't have access to and the only types of food that they have access to?
I mean, I think it certainly plays a role. We know that diabetes, for example, is quite prevalent among Latinx population in general, and so of course that filters down to to being the majority of farm workers too. So certainly, having access and affordability for safe and healthy foods is that would be the optimum vision. Um, the I think I was going to say that one of the most challenging parts of my job, but also the part of my job that brings the most heart really is, being when I have those moments to do trainings with our community-based organization partners, with those promotores de salud that are out in the communities, that are they might be current farm workers or former farm workers, or certainly from farm worker families themselves. And when they have that comfort to be able to share their stories with you. And sometimes it's about the living conditions, that you mentioned. And I think one story I remember hearing that I'd love to share. It was the story of a young man. I think he was about 17, and he was working in the strawberry fields, and he just lived with his younger brother. And he had said he was working so hard always. He'd get home from work and he would just be ready to collapse, at night. And so a lot of the times, like, he was so tired, he would just be in his work clothes and just crash into bed. But his younger brother shared a bed with him, and because they couldn't afford something different. And he had received the pesticide safety training that some of the promotores gave him. And when he learned about how those pesticide residues can really negatively impact both the cognitive and physical development of his younger brother, it was one of those like just life-changing moments for him. And he said, from that point on, no matter how tired he was, he took the time change, to kind of change out of those work clothes the minute he came home, and to take a quick shower, before climbing into bed. And that has always stayed with me and kind of driven me, I think, in the work that I do, just knowing there can be these huge and overwhelming problems, out there. And sometimes policy, even with its best intention, it can be slower. It doesn't necessarily keep up with these changes that we know have to happen in order for farm workers and farm worker families to better protect themselves. But that there can be these moments of really simple kinds of change. And when those messages are delivered by trusted people and in the right way, that can really change people's lives, And so I've just always found that something really inspiring. And that keeps me going, in this kind of work that we do.
It is. It's an inspiring story, and it also goes to show, it's this small bit of information that truly is life-changing. I mean, it affects your health, it affects families, and people don't realize how strong these chemicals are, working out there, and how dangerous that they can be, just sitting there on your skin and inhaling that. But you mentioned something about, how there are like really difficult parts of your job and then really rewarding and inspiring parts. And that was actually my next question for both of you was, what are the best parts of your job and what are the most difficult parts?
I mean, I think I really do find that the best parts of my job are when I'm out traveling and meeting either those promotoras or doing focus groups with farm workers to find out how the projects that we've created, how are those really impacting kind of those that they're really meant to impact positively. How can we shift things around and make things make changes so that they can be more impactful as we move forward. So I think that those are definitely the most sort of rewarding moments. And I think the challenging part can sometimes be, Alexis mentioned we are a small and mighty team, and yet there's so much work to be done, out there. There's work for so many of our teams, to really be able to bring change about. And so I think sometimes it can be hard just recognizing that there is a lot of change that still needs to happen. And how do we kind of stay energized and resilient, in order to be able to keep doing that kind of work.
I agree. The slow pace of change can be really challenging. I think if you go to a farm worker community, if you go especially to employer-funded housing where farm workers live, you will see many of the same conditions that Dolores fought for when she was, co-founding the United Farm Workers, that were featured in Harvest of Shame. Those conditions remain. And that was 50, 60 years ago. So, I mean, it can be a challenge to continue to fight for these changes, to be an advocate when you know that it's so hard to do and it's so slow. But just like Becca, what keeps me motivated are the farm workers themselves. And the best part, just like Becca, the best part is having the opportunity to talk to farm workers and to be in the communities. And I think you see resilience, you see pride, you see that dignity. And I think, Becca and I have both been at Farmworker Justice for many years. We work with many advocates who have been in the farm worker movement, worked in farm worker organizations for years. And I think that's because, despite the challenges, there are so many reasons to motivate. And I think just being with others who have the same passion, but also with the workers themselves who also have that passion and, just have that ganas. It's just something that, it can't help but keep you motivated to continue the work despite all the obstacles. And there are victories. There were in the mid 2000s, in the mid 2010s, we improved the worker protection standard and we strengthened those protections. This year, the Department of Labor put forth stronger protections for H-2A workers. OSHA just published a heath standard that is a proposed regulation and likely will take a little bit before it's finalized, but that's a huge step and can be extremely meaningful. So, things are happening. And I think we also have to be proud of the victories around pesticides, around heat, around worker protections that are happening currently around the country. And that is thanks to all of the advocates on the ground, those community-based organizations, the workers who have asserted their rights and who have really pushed for change.
So what does the future of food justice and farm worker justice look like to you both?
I guess sort of if thinking about like an ideal vision, maybe for food justice for farm workers, I'll go back to kind of these three words that sort of define food justice for me. And so it's thinking about health, about accessibility, and about affordability. And so really thinking and kind of centering the farm worker within those words. So for those that are harvesting our fruits and vegetables, what is a system looking like that would really support their health and well-being for them and for their families,
Right.
ensuring that they do have access both physically in terms of getting to stores that provide healthy food, and then for them to actually be able to afford, buying that food.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think that is something worth striving for.
I will also add, I think, it's where the consumer is really engaged in the issues of farm workers. During the COVID pandemic, during the height of the COVID pandemic, when we were all sheltering in place, and farm workers, along with others, were deemed essential workers, and they continued to work despite the hazards of COVID-19. And there was this moment where everyone realized the contributions of farm workers. And there were all of these news articles about farm workers and their contributions and their role as essential. And then it kind of went away once we kind of got into a new stage of COVID. And I think the future of our food system, the future of food justice, is keeping that acknowledgement. And as Becca said, really centering the worker and, not just saying, oh, hey, farm workers are essential because they're out there and there's a wildfire and we are inside and they are out there while there's smoke, in the air and the air quality is like 200 plus, right? How can in those moments, or not just in those moments, how can we ensure that we continually think about farm workers and engage as consumers with the system, not just at the grocery store, but from the planting of those fruits and vegetables all the way to when they get to your grocery store.
Right. So what projects should we look out for at Farm Worker Justice? How can we and our viewers and our people who are interested, how can we support those projects? What are they? I want to give you some space to kind of talk about what you're doing and how we can help.
Sure. So we have a great project that we just lifted sort of off the ground in the spring. And this is a project, it's focused on wildfire preparedness, and it's funded by the EPA.
Mhm.
And with this project, we're working with various partners in Washington State. And we'll be, even though we'll be giving them tools and preparing tools to help educate farm workers. We're also really using that as as an experience for us to be able to learn more about how wildfires are impacting farm worker communities.
Mhm.
This project was really inspired because uh, we had known over these last few years, especially, there were some communities of highly made up of farm workers that were impacted um, by wildfires. And again, thinking about the extra factors that many farm worker families have in place,
Mhm.
that when these emergencies happen, can become sort of multi-layered.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's a really exciting project for us. We'll be developing a whole toolkit of materials in these months to come that will focus. And we've been doing more work kind of around climate change in general. So that's one of the project ends. But then we also have our policy work that really companions that. Alexis had mentioned the heat stress work and policy work that we've been involved in and really helped to inform for many years now. Um, I think that that's something that uh, for viewers out there, whether or not you're working in the fields,
Mhm.
so many of us are now feeling those impacts of
Oh,
heat,
yeah.
right? And so I think that that's one of those topics that really um, it's pretty easy, to sort of call out to get many people interested and involved in, just because we're seeing those extremes in such exacerbated ways. And then, of course, this past week with that very horrific flooding that
Yeah.
has occurred in North Carolina and Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, um, in our southeast, and these communities that that had been in fairly flourishing condition, and then having this one really traumatic event that happens that really just kind of can change everything.
Right.
And we know that there are farm worker communities out there that were impacted, by those floods too. So yeah, so I think that we're moving more and more in that direction of doing more climate work, as we go along.
Farm workers are really at the front lines of climate change. And so that's why we are more engaged in climate change work and climate justice work. We have been engaged for quite a bit of time, but I think the urgency is finally being felt by everyone.
Mhm.
And so there's more happening in climate change and to addressing the issues that are impacting our communities. And so we are certainly engaged in that. And then, of course, thinking about economic mobility. And we always continue, our work around health and access to healthcare, because we need our farm worker communities to be healthy, and we want them to be able to access healthcare and be and live in healthy and safe environments.
Right. I'm really excited to see the projects come out from Farmworker Justice, and we'll definitely be sure to share all of that, with our viewers. Um, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
We certainly encourage you to visit our website. We have a lot of information about the work that we're doing, but also about the materials that we've created. We've created a lot of materials, not only for workers, but also for advocates and others. And so and in multiple languages, in Spanish and English in Haitian Creole, indigenous languages. We also, what I would also encourage your viewers to go to our YouTube channel. We do have we have interviews, of course, with advocates, and we have, materials, but we also do have these short films, these videos that are, created with farm worker communities, and really do highlight that intersection between, climate justice, racial justice, economic justice, health justice. And so we certainly encourage you to visit both our YouTube channel and our website for more information.
And as a reminder to everyone watching, don't forget to sign up for this year's Food Justice Film Festival at foodjusticefilmfestival.com. As always, the festival is completely free to sign up and free to watch all 4 feature films anytime from October 24th through October 27th. You can also catch all of our 2024 virtual interviews on our site all year long. Thank you so much, and thank you to Becca and Alexis for joining me today. And everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.